During the 3rd millennium BC, while Egypt and Mesopotamia flourished in the west, another great civilization emerged in South Asia. Centered on the Indus River, it eventually spread across a vast area of what is today Pakistan and northwestern India. Its people built great cities, developed extensive trade networks, and created the earliest urban civilization of the Indian subcontinent. Today, it is known as the Indus Valley Civilization or the Harappan Civilization, after Harappa, one of its principal cities. Yet, unlike its contemporaries in the West, much about its people remains unknown. Their writing has never been deciphered, leaving archaeology as our principal window into their world. In this video, we will explore the history and culture of this remarkable civilization and discover what everyday life was like for its people. The roots of the Indus civilization can be traced back thousands of years before the appearance of its famous cities. One of the most important early settlements was Mehergarh. Beginning around 7000 BC, communities here gradually adopted agriculture and animal husbandry. Wheat and barley were cultivated, while cattle, sheep and goats became increasingly important. Over the following millennia, permanent villages spread across the region and their inhabitants developed increasingly sophisticated crafts. By the 4th and early 3rd millennia BC, numerous regional cultures had emerged across the great Indus region. Settlements grew larger, agricultural production increased, and trade connected communities separated by hundreds of kilometers. Towns like Kot Diji and Rehman Deri already possessed many features that anticipated the later civilization. This period is usually known as the early Harappan phase. Beginning around 2600 BC, regional traditions that had previously differed from one another became increasingly integrated into a much wider cultural system. Many older settlements were abandoned, while new towns and cities were constructed. Standardized bricks, pottery, weights, seals, and other objects began appearing across an enormous geographical area. This marked the beginning of the mature Harappan period and the civilization's greatest age. But before we turn to its golden age, we should first look at the geography of the region. To the west lay the mountains of Balochistan, separating the Indus Plains from the Iranian plateau. To the north rose the Himalayas and Hindu Kush, while the Arabian Sea provided access to maritime routes leading towards the Persian Gulf. To the east stretched the Thar Desert and the plains of northwestern India. The civilization developed around several major river systems. Most important was the Indus itself, fed by the rivers of the Punjab before flowing south through Sindh and into the Arabian Sea. Further east, hundreds of settlements were established along another river system, the now largely dry Gagar Hakra, often identified with the ancient Sarasvati. Although today much of this region is dry, it supported dense settlement during the Harappan period. This enormous territory contained a variety of environments. Some communities lived beside great rivers, others along the coast or in comparatively dry regions, such as Gujarat. Nevertheless, they participated in a remarkably interconnected cultural system. At its center stood several great cities. Harappa, from which the civilization takes its alternative name, developed beside the Ravi River in the Punjab. Hundreds of kilometers to the south stood Mohenjo-Daro, probably the largest city of the civilization. Other major centers included Ganwaliwala and Rakhigarhi, while the remarkable city of Dholavira stood on what was then an island in the region of Kutch. Surrounding these cities were hundreds of smaller towns, villages, industrial settlements, and seasonal camps. The majority of the population never lived in the great urban centers. Most were farmers and pastoralists. The agricultural surplus produced by the surrounding countryside helped support the craftsmen and merchants of the cities. Wheat and barley were among the principal crops, accompanied by pulses such as peas, lentils, and chickpeas. The Harappans also cultivated sesame and were among the earliest societies to make extensive use of cotton. In some regions, particularly towards Gujarat and the eastern parts of the civilization, farmers increasingly experimented with rice and various millets. Animal husbandry was equally important. Cattle, particularly the distinctive Hamd Zebu, were central to the economy, alongside sheep, goats, and water buffalo. Fishing and the exploitation of wild resources provided additional sources of food. The enormous variety of environments within the civilization was actually one of its greatest strengths. Different regions produced different crops and raw materials, creating an extensive internal network of exchange. The most impressive achievement of the Indus civilization was undoubtedly its urban development. Harappan cities were not identical, but they shared a number of basic characteristics. Streets were often carefully planned, while settlements were divided into separate districts, sometimes built upon enormous artificial platforms. The most famous example is Mohenjo-daro. Much of the city was constructed from standardized baked bricks. Major streets divided residential blocks containing houses of greatly varying sizes. Many houses were organized around internal courtyards, providing privacy from the streets outside. Some had several rooms and probably more than one story. But what truly distinguishes Mohenjo-daro is its management of water. More than 700 brick-lined wells were constructed throughout the city. Many houses possessed their own bathing areas, where water flowed across carefully laid floors before passing into drains. Household drains emptied into larger covered channels running alongside the streets. Access points allowed these drains to be cleaned when necessary. Perhaps the most famous structure of all was the Great Bath. Located on the city's elevated mound, it consisted of a large brick-lined pool surrounded by rooms and corridors. The structure was carefully waterproofed and could be filled and drained. Its precise purpose is unknown, but its elaborate construction and prominent location suggests that bathing possessed some ritual significance. This concern with water was not limited to Mohenjo-daro. At Dholavira, where water was far less abundant, the inhabitants built massive reservoirs which collected and stored water, demonstrating how Harappan engineers adapted their cities to very different local environments. What is equally striking, however, is what these cities lacked. Unlike Egypt and Mesopotamia, the highly organized Indus cities contained no obvious monumental temples or palaces. Even several large structures once identified as palaces or granaries can no longer be interpreted with such confidence. The Harappans were exceptionally skilled craftsmen. Workshops produced pottery, shell ornaments, metal objects, stone tools, faience, and enormous quantities of beads. Carnelian was particularly prized. Craftsmen developed elaborate techniques for cutting, drilling, and heating the stone to create its characteristic deep red color. Raw materials traveled enormous distances. High-quality flint from the Rori Hills was distributed throughout the civilization. Shells were obtained from the Arabian Sea, while agate and carnelian came particularly from Gujarat. Copper could be acquired from Rajasthan and other neighbouring regions, while lapis lazuli ultimately came from the distant mines of Badakhshan in Afghanistan. The existence of these networks required an efficient system for moving and measuring goods. The Harappans developed standardized cubical stone weights that were used throughout their territory. The appearance of the same systems across settlements separated by enormous distances is one of the strongest indications that the civilization possessed some form of overarching economic and administrative organization. Transport took place by land and water. Ox-drawn carts were used for shorter journeys, while rivers provided natural highways through the plains. Maritime trade connected coastal settlements with Oman, Bahrain, and ultimately Mesopotamia. To the Mesopotamians, the distant land of the Indus was known as Meluha. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, Harappan products were reaching Mesopotamian cities. Sumerian texts mention imports including timber, ivory, and carnelian. By the reign of Sargon of Akkad in the 24th and 23rd centuries BC, ships from Meluha were said to have reached Mesopotamia itself. The connection became substantial enough for people from the Indus region to reside there. One Akkadian period seal belonged to a man described as a Meluha interpreter. Curiously, however, while Harappan objects are relatively well represented in Mesopotamia, very few Mesopotamian objects have been discovered in the Indus cities. Exactly what the Harappans received in return, therefore, remains unclear. Perhaps the greatest mystery of the Indus civilization is who actually ruled it. In Egypt, pharaohs covered temples and tombs with their names and images. Mesopotamian kings commissioned statues, inscriptions, and palaces celebrating their military victories and their relationship with the gods. Nothing comparable has been discovered in the Indus world. There are differences in the sizes of houses and in access to valuable goods, suggesting that Harappan society was not completely egalitarian. Some individuals clearly possessed greater wealth and status than others, yet there are no royal tombs filled with treasure, no buildings that can confidently be identified as royal palaces, and no monuments glorifying individual rulers. Even the famous stone sculpture from Mohenjo-daro, traditionally called the Priest King, provides no evidence that the man depicted was either a priest or a king. Nevertheless, some form of effective authority must have existed. Constructing cities, maintaining drainage systems, and regulating trade across such a vast territory required considerable organization. Several possibilities have therefore been proposed. The civilization may have formed a single integrated state. Alternatively, political authority may have been divided among several regional centers. Other scholars have suggested a more decentralized system, in which power was shared among consuls, merchants, landowners, religious authorities, or occupational groups. Whatever its exact form, Harappan political organization seems to have differed considerably from the highly personalized kingship of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Warfare is similarly difficult to identify. Weapons are surprisingly uncommon, and there are no convincing representations of armies and battles. The massive walls surrounding many settlements may have served partly as defensive structures, but they also protected against floods, controlled movement into cities, and perhaps displayed civic power. There is likewise little evidence for widespread violent destruction during the civilization's flourishing period. This does not prove that the Harappans never fought, but warfare seems to have occupied a far less visible place in their society than among their contemporaries. Our understanding of Harappan religion is extremely limited. Much of the evidence comes from seals and other small objects depicting scenes that appear to have had religious significance. Animals played a particularly prominent role. Bulls, elephants, rhinoceroses, and tigers appear alongside the mysterious one-horned creature, the most common animal depicted on Harappan seals. Trees also seem to have possessed religious significance, particularly the pipal tree. Other seals depict human figures surrounded by animals. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro may indicate that water and ritual purification played an important role, while structures interpreted as fire altars have been discovered at several sites. Nevertheless, the meaning of Harappan religious practices remains largely speculative. One of the greatest obstacles to understanding their civilization is the Indus script itself. The writing system developed gradually during the centuries preceding the mature Harappan period. Signs resembling those of the later script appear at Harappa during the late 4th millennium BC, and by the early Harappan period, short sequences of signs were already being used. The fully developed script appeared alongside the rise of the great cities. Several hundred different signs are known. They appear most commonly on the seals, usually above the image of an animal, but inscriptions have also been discovered on tablets, pottery, and other objects. The script was generally written from right to left, and the surviving inscriptions are remarkably short, averaging only 4 or 5 signs. The seals themselves were probably used to identify individuals or goods. Despite more than a century of attempts, the script has never been deciphered, largely because no bilingual inscription comparable to the Rosetta Stone has ever been discovered. The short length of the surviving texts makes the problem even more difficult. Based on the number and patterns of its signs, many scholars believe that it was probably a logosyllabic writing system, combining signs representing words with signs representing sounds. As for the language itself, an early Dravidian language has frequently been proposed, while other possibilities include a lost language, sometimes referred to as Paramunda. It is also possible that several languages were spoken across the Harappan world, even if only one was used for writing. A minority of scholars have even questioned whether the Indus signs represented spoken language at all, suggesting instead that they formed a system of religious and political symbols. This interpretation has not gained widespread acceptance, however, as the regular patterns in which the signs occur provide strong evidence that they represented a genuine writing system. Around 1900 BC, the system that had connected the Harappan world began to break apart. The great cities declined, standardized weights and seals disappeared from many regions, long-distance exchange weakened, specialized industries contracted, and settlements increasingly returned to local styles of pottery and material culture. The decline was neither uniform nor simultaneous. Tolavira declined and was eventually abandoned, while Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa continued to be occupied in reduced forms. In Gujarat, many communities survived, but life became increasingly rural and locally organized. Earlier archaeologists famously blamed the collapse on an invasion of Indo-Aryan peoples. However, this theory is no longer supported by the archaeological evidence, as there is no widespread destruction that would indicate the civilization was overthrown by an invading army. The decline was probably the result of several interconnected processes. Environmental change seemed to have been particularly important. River systems shifted repeatedly across the plains. In the east, changes in the courses of the Yamuna and later the Sutlej dramatically reduced the water flowing through the Gagar-Hakra system, a region that had previously supported an enormous concentration of Harappan settlements. The wider climate was also becoming increasingly dry, encouraging people to move towards regions with more reliable water supplies. At the same time, the economic networks that had helped bind the civilization together weakened. Long-distance trade declined, and standardized production became less important. By around 1300 BC, the Indus civilization had effectively come to an end. Its people, however, did not disappear. Many communities survived, and new regional cultures developed across South Asia. The great cities, however, were gradually abandoned and eventually forgotten, before being rediscovered thousands of years later.